Okay, in theory, there's supposed to be an hour with Rebecca Moesta. I'm here. I'm not sure that I'm that complex that I will take an hour. I know. That's Kevin. He's only here to plump out the audience, so it makes it look like there's 20% more people than there are. Oh, yay. Okay, tweeting's good. My name's Rebecca Moesta. It is pronounced Moesta, not Moesta or Mesner or Moesta or any of the other possibilities. It's a Germanic extraction, but there aren't a lot of Moestas in the world, even in Germany, so it's a fairly rare name. And I have some publishing myths I can talk about, or if you'd like to ask questions instead, we could ask questions, but I don't think that will last very long.
Where do you get your ideas?
Quiet, you. Did you want to hear anything about publishing myths, or is there anybody who would like to? Okay. Everybody said with relief, sure, talk about something we don't know what we're doing here either. That's right. It's claiming it has an hour left. Okay. And we have 2 more people. One of my favorite publishing myths is that is a little bit like what Kevin spoke about the first evening here, is that anybody who has the time can write a book. It's not true that you can write a book just by attempting to write a book. Otherwise, we'd have even more books in the world than there are now. About 90% of people who consider writing a book never even start the book. It always stays as a concept in their brain. And these are not exact numbers, but of the people who start writing, about 90% of those people get lost in the process of writing the book and never get to the finish line. I used to have this happen a lot, that I would start a book and then I would be unsure where I was going with it exactly, and then I'd get another idea for a different book or a short story. And so I'd hair off, start working on that. And of course, once you get out of the process of writing your book, it takes some sinking back into it and thinking about it again. So chances are you don't get back to that book after you get disrupted from the process of writing. So 90% of people never even start the book that they're thinking of, and 90% of the people who start do not finish. And 90% of professional writers have lives far busier than the average person who thinks that they could write a book if they only had the time. So the people who write the book, they're just that busy, but they wrote it anyway. I talked about if you can write a good paragraph, you can write a good book. Because my father was an English teacher for 25 years, and because I started helping him forever and ever ago, I thought, I'm really good at this. If I ever decide to write a book, it's going to be killer, because I'm really good at English. I can sling a mean word or two. I can string them together. I can string together paragraphs. I can get A's on essays. I am going to rock the literary world. Well, just because you can write a good paragraph does not mean you can write a good book. There are a lot of different layers and skills in writing, and until I started actually writing a novel, I didn't know how much stuff I did not know about writing. I didn't know that you couldn't just have 6 chapters in a row where people sit in a room and talk. I didn't know that you actually had to leave the room and do something in most cases. Sure, you can get away with a short story about doing the breakfast dishes, but it is highly unlikely that you can manage to make that interesting as a book. Something has to happen. I knew nothing about how to plot a book. Even if you can plot a short story, that's not the same as plotting a book. There's also pacing. I did not know that you couldn't put all of the sitting and thinking and talking chapters at the beginning, and then a couple of doing stuff chapters, and then a whole bunch more sitting and talking about stuff the end. I did not know that's not how a book worked. I didn't know that you have to break things up. I didn't know that there were settings and world building that I had to do before I started, and that I couldn't just kind of explore it with my readers, and that I needed to know more of it to start with than my readers knew. So there was that. I didn't realize that even a single chapter needs to have a setting. Just because I'm in some magical fantasy world doesn't mean that I don't need to describe where we are, what we're doing in each individual chapter, because the reader wants to know. They want to be able to visualize. And that's another thing I had no clue about. I did not know how to describe things so that my reader knew what I was seeing, because I had it all in my head. I had no idea it wasn't going on the paper. I thought, by reading the words that I wrote, that the reader would see what I saw, but I wasn't describing it. I didn't know I had to do that. If I could do it, I would write an entire book in nothing but dialogue. I love dialogue. I didn't know that just because I'm good at dialogue doesn't mean I can tell a coherent story. I didn't know that deciding on a theme and building a story around that is really kind of backwards. You certainly can, and you might want to as part of a writing exercise, but chances are, if you've only got a theme and you've got no interesting characters and nothing for them to do, your story's not going to get enough people for you to tell them about what your theme is. Characters. I thought if I loved a character, that would just come through, and that I could just build a couple of characters that I cared about, and I didn't have to know what they were going to do with that. I could just follow them around and watch them and write down what they said. Spelling, grammar, punctuation. I knew that part. I had that nailed. I was totally there. There's also effective use of language. I thought that if I could use a lot of adjectives and adverbs and say things in a slightly different way or use metaphors, that I was effectively using language. But that can get really taxing and weighed down and get in the way of the story if that's all you know how to do. Point of view. I didn't know that a lot of times people expect to be looking through the eyes of the character you're writing from. They expect to be able to see what that character sees around the room, know what that character knows, have internal dialogue from that character. I had always thought that things were written like C.S. Lewis from the omniscient point of view, and that somebody was looking down on all of these puppets and knowing what everybody's head was in everybody's head. But when I started to put it into practice, writing stories, I would be seeing something mainly from my main character's point of view, but I would also jump over and drop into somebody else's head, even though I was talking as the main character. I didn't know that that meant there was a shift in the point of view of the person, which is why some people write what's known as frame stories, where, you sit down in the bar with some stranger who knows the whole story, and he knows what everybody was thinking, doing it every time, and then you sink into the story, and that person can tell the story from everybody's point of view because he already knows what happened in every part of it. I didn't even know what a frame story was, and I didn't know that was one way of presenting a point of view. I just really thought that the author knew everything, and therefore the reader got to know everything. I didn't know that you could use voice for different characters, that all of the characters in the whole book didn't talk like English teachers' daughters, for example, because I certainly do. And in fact, when I write for young adults, I will have a kid being very precocious and knowing quite long words because I did. But not everybody's like that. So it's okay to develop one character like that or one character and their best friend like that, but not to have everybody in the entire book speak like that. I didn't know that my characters had to have a conflict. Sure, I knew there was always something that drove the story, but I didn't know that there was always a conflict between what the character wanted and getting there. There's also logic and internal consistency that makes a story good. There's research that goes into some things. Now, I never thought of a story as something I needed to research. But then I discovered that even if I'm basing my society on medieval society, I didn't even know how medieval society worked. I didn't know how the weapons worked. I didn't know what systems of exchange and barter were, or getting things to market, and I knew nothing about that. So there's research involved just in making sure I've built a world. And there's also part of a good book is appealing to your target audience. If I'm writing for young adults and I'm writing about 90-year-old people in a rest home, I might not. It might be a fascinating story, but I might not be hitting my target audience. I might not be drawing those people in to be interested. So I didn't know that there were all these layers to writing a good book. I thought it was all knowing the English language, and everything came from that. So that is a myth. Just writing a good paragraph does not string together into a good book. Another thing is that there are totally different. A lot of people think good writing is good writing, whether you're writing fiction or nonfiction. No, not true. Good writing in nonfiction has a completely different purpose from good writing in fiction. In nonfiction, you're going for clarity. You're going for a factual basis. You want a logical flow so that people can dip in and get the information out that they're going for. You need a layout that you can follow. Sometimes you need headers for every couple of paragraphs, depending. I used to write for a national laboratory, a weapons laboratory, and I would write how to handle nuclear materials so that you did not kill yourself or the rest of the world, for example. And shorter, better. More description, not better. This kind of nonfiction, you wrote it as basic a level as possible. You don't want there to be any extra figuring out, no referring back to this page and that page. You want to make it as simple and straightforward as possible. Accessibility. how easy is it to find what you need? In a lot of nonfiction, you need an index. Chances are your fiction does not need an index. Sometimes you might want a list of characters, but chances are you don't need that index. Nonfiction recipe book, really want an index. Sometimes go so far as to index by individual ingredients, something you wouldn't need to do in a handbook about handling nuclear materials. But knowing what exactly your subject is and what the appropriate display is for that subject is very important in nonfiction. It's not so in fiction. And then nonfiction has to be judged by the fulfillment of its purpose. Was the purpose to instruct somebody in how to do something? We recently got a diet book because I was very interested in the Paleolithic diet, paleo, and I ordered a few different books, and there were some books that just had stories and story of like Glog the caveman, and I was trying to find, okay, just tell me how to put it into practice. Where's the part where they say, eat this, don't combine these things, eat at certain times of day. Just give me the information. If you don't give the information to the reader in a useful way, you're not fulfilling your purpose. If your purpose is to inspire, that can be entirely different. If you're reading a Deepak Chopra book, its purpose is different. You're not really looking for an index on spiritual enlightenment or whatever it is that the purpose is of reading that book. You can instruct through fiction as well. You can inform and you can inspire, but those aren't the primary purposes. So, very different how you approach them. One of my pet peeves. Oh dear. Remember I told you about the one where it used to be a pet peeve of mine if there were any errors in the book, any typos or anything. I thought, this person, A, doesn't know what they're doing, and B, doesn't care about the quality of what they're publishing. One of my other pet peeves comes from a commercial there used to be on American television. I don't know if it showed up here, but it probably did because it was by Xerox. And there was a professor at the front of the classroom that said, "Of course everyone deserves to be published, but it's a matter of money." Well, I contend that not everybody deserves to be published. Now, everybody has the right to be published. It's a free world, at least many places in the world. Some countries you can't publish whatever you want. And, everybody has the right. Most people have the access to it. It's no longer a question of money. But the question is, do you have something to say that needs to be said to a wider audience? And that's where I draw the line. I don't think everybody deserves to be published. Not everything needs to be shared with the world. Publish means to make available widely. And there's a difference between, say, writing your life story for your family and writing your life story for the world. So publishing is not necessarily something, your life story may not necessarily be something that deserves to be published. It may be extremely boring and not inspirational and maybe not helpful to anyone and maybe not even cautionary, which is also a way to help people. But it may be worth telling to the few people you care about. That doesn't mean it deserves to be published. Professional publishing is a different category from self-publishing. And it's not because it is the only legitimate way of publishing, but because it goes through a different step. And one of those steps is a winnowing process, where somebody in a professional situation is betting their own dollars and cents that your story is interesting enough to share with other people that they can sell that story to. That their readers who read their books, whether they're romances or mysteries or what have you, are going to be interested also. So the editor, the professional editor, has the responsibility not just to make you happy by publishing whatever it is you want to write, but to make their readers happy and to earn money for the people who own the company. There are a lot of times when you can personally publish something that doesn't go through a professional process, and you could hit the jackpot without being ever professionally edited by somebody. You could write the best book ever, and you could be discovered and gradually build up an audience, and it would find the rest of the world. But one of the coolest things about professional publishing is they usually already have an in where they can find a lot of people who want to read the types of books that they publish. So what they can do for you is find you those people that are going to want to read your book. If you publish it yourself and just put it out there to sink or swim, what you have to do 99.99999 times out of 100 is spend a huge part of your day, week, month, year doing publicity for your own book and letting people know it exists and why they would want to read it. And that's a huge job. We already did the errors. Oh, and another myth, one of my favorites, is that all copy editing is pretty much the same. If you know English, you can copy edit anything that gets put in front of you. Actually, not. There are different purposes to copy editing, just like writing good fiction is not the same as writing good nonfiction. In fiction, you edit for prose consistency, and you preserve the author's style. If the author has a style, you preserve that. You don't come in to put your view or your... if you're a frustrated author, you don't write it the way you would have written it. Yes, I know I'm listening to myself. Don't eat. My husband's nodding. Yes. Also, in dialogue, when it's fiction, it's okay for a character to misspeak. It's okay for a character to have terrible grammar. It's okay to drop letters right and left. As long as that character is consistent as him or herself, you can write them any way you want. They can be as smart or as dumb or as illiterate or as perhaps learning throughout the book. They can go as Eliza Doolittle did, from being basically a street person with terrible grammar to speaking as well as a princess. So be careful if you're copy editing or if you're being copy edited, that they're not taking all of the flavor out of what you've read. Nonfiction, you're editing for usability, understandability, and accuracy. Completely different approach. And those are just some of many other myths of publishing that there's not time for. But does anybody have any questions? Yes?
Can you sort of tell, I know just from reading a little bit about your bio and stuff, but could you sort of tell your publishing story a little bit? How you went into it?
could I tell my publishing story and how I got into it? Okay, how I got into publishing is I didn't know what I was doing. I didn't have other friends who wanted to be published writers. I didn't have any feel for how to go about it, so I would just start things and not finish them, and start other things and not finish them. And I had nobody encouraging me, go, write that book, or can I have the next chapter? There was nobody who was really that interested in it, except for me. And so eventually, when I was a grown-up, I had told myself, someday I'll finish writing this when I have the time, when my life calms down, when it's just not as busy, and discovered life just keeps getting more complicated. It's very complicated, and I never got around to it. There was never that opening that I was looking for to write my book. So I would just do it in little snatches here and there and get distracted. I'm that dog in the movie that says squirrel and in Up, and I'm looking to the next thing. Well, when I was in my 30s or so, I was working for Lawrence Livermore National Laboratory, and I started a science fiction and fantasy group where we would read a book and we would discuss it. And I found that very fulfilling because I could, dissect writing mentally, but I wasn't doing it myself. I was still enjoying it. But somebody suggested that we invite a local author to speak to our group. And we read a book called Resurrection Incorporated, which was the first novel of a local author. And I did not quite have the nerve to ask a real author to come to speak to our group, so somebody else in the group did. And we set up an auditorium, and he came to speak, and it was a big group event. And when he arrived, I had been looking for a month around the laboratory campus for some older gentleman, well-respected and mature in his years, to see if I could spot this author who was in our midst at the laboratory. And it turned out that he was 5 years younger than me when he showed up. Pretty young, snot-nosed kid arrives and gives this talk to our science fiction group, and I was just astounded because I thought, well, I should be able to write better than he does. I'm older than he is. I've been trying longer. What is wrong with what I write? Apparently, you have to finish it. This is one of the keys that he shared with me that I did not know, that you have to finish something before you can even send it out to be published. And so I had been messing around all of this time without ever talking to a professional writer to have somebody say, you know what, snap out of it, finish something. So I finally did. I started to focus more on the writing and finish something. I don't think I actually did until after we were married. That might be. Oh, yes, this is Kevin. Is my husband. This was the snot-nosed writer who is 5 years younger than me, who knew since the time he was 5 years old that he wanted to be a writer, and actually worked his rear end off in order to be a writer. And I was working my rear end off, a few minutes a day maybe, or a few minutes a week, and without a purpose. I was meandering. I didn't know where to go with it. I didn't even know there was something called a writer's market where you could look up who published what kinds of books and know that you could send a book to that editor and say, okay, you publish romance. I'd like to present this romance book to you. I didn't know that there was such a thing as a query letter where you would say, would you be interested in reading this book? I didn't know that there were places you could go to meet editors and to get to know them personally. I didn't know that you could hang out with writers and that some of their knowledge might rub off on you so that you would know you had to finish the story first. I didn't know any of that. Kevin had been doing all of that. He had been hanging out with writers. He had been getting to know editors. He had been coming up through the bottom of every kind of publication there was since he was in junior high and trying to get them to publish his work. I could have done that. I could have done that in high school. I didn't think of it. What was I doing? So, yeah, I came up the really, really slow way. And the first couple things I got published were short stories, and I was still writing with a mentality of young adult. And then Kevin asked me to be in an anthology because I was like sleeping with the editor. And so I got that job.
So that's a way to get published.
So that's, get to know editors really, really well. I really do not suggest this method. It does work occasionally. It's 1 in a million, but it can happen.
So you were kidding when you answered that on stage.
No, he wanted to humiliate me in public. He was not kidding. I did. But that's not the way I meant to get published first. I did try other methods.
When they do the, honey, can I be in your anthology?
Yes. Did I do that? I think I did. I think I did, honey, can I be in your anthology?
I actually thought I said, I want you in the anthology, and I had to beat you up to do a story.
That might have been too. I can't remember who twisted whose arm. I remember when I was still trying to write on my own and still finish my first thing, he was introducing me to authors and editors and getting me to be more comfortable with that group. And several of them said, I don't know if I can say this in the podcast, but one in particular who was a multi-award winning author said, Rebecca, this is chicken shit. Pick your best story, go home and finish it. And so I did. I never had anybody talk to me like that, but she was right. And then after that, because I had the interest in young adult, Kevin's going to tell that story. That's next hour. I can't tell all of that story. But gradually, as you get to be known for writing, then people will offer you the ability to be in anthologies and to write books.
So you didn't start with an agent, but you have one now?
I borrowed Kevin's agent. I didn't sleep with him, I swear. But yeah, I didn't have an agent to start with, no. It was that way more than you wanted to know.
I love hearing stories.
You can talk about people working with an agent before they've written anything, people coming to our door.
Oh, yeah. One of the big fallacies, one of the big myths of publishing is you need... I said phallus? Yeah, I know. I'm sorry. One of the big things that people come to us about is, I need an agent. And chances are you don't. First of all, if you don't have anything finished, like I didn't have anything finished at first, you don't need an agent. The very, very, very first step in getting published is to finish something. Now, if it's a short story, again, you don't need an agent. There are places to send short fiction. There are magazines, there are online sites that publish. There are a lot of professional markets available for short stories. There are even some publishers that will do minis and publish a short story as a mini. So there are a lot of ways to go, and usually those pay anywhere from, $3,000 to 3 cents a word to $1 a word if you're really at the high end. So if you have an agent, the agent wants to take 15%. And if you got paid $200 for the story, you really don't want to shell out $30 to your agent of that very small amount you just got paid.
And the editors of short story stuff usually don't want to deal with an agent.
That's true. If somebody buys short stories, going through an agent is much more difficult than dealing with the author personally for several reasons. One, people change agents. So if you have an agent that represented a short story and you are now with a different agent and somebody resells the anthology and your reprint rights for that story that you wrote for $200 are now $20 for the German edition or something of that, then they have to send the check to your old agent, the old agent whom you have left behind, either because they weren't right for you or you had a creative difference or because somebody else was going to sell a lot more of your work. You left them behind. They still are the gatekeeper to all of those things that you sold through them. And so they get the $20. They get to take their cut off the top, the $3, and then they send you the $17. And this can take months to go through a process like that. So it's not worthwhile either monetarily or yeah, I was going to say emotionally, but yes, time-wise is probably better. But once you have a finished novel and something that's finished and in good shape, good enough shape that you believe it's ready to make its entrance into the world and be shown to an editor, you might need an agent, but unless you have some in with a really good agent, a bad agent can be worse than no agent at all. A bad agent can accept your book and say that they'll work on selling it. Sometimes they send it out to one place. Sometimes they don't really know what they're doing. If they're actually looking for people who are unpublished, chances are they are not a good agent. So anybody who would have you as a client may not be worth having. It's kind of the Groucho Marx thing, and I wouldn't join any club that would have me as a member. So they might try to talk to a couple of people and do nothing with it. Kevin had an agent who was actually arrested for mail fraud, and she was guilty of gross malfeasance on top of that because she would tell Kevin she was sending his book and stories around and didn't. So they were just sitting there. So he was all excited that he had an agent, and it wasn't doing him any good at all. He would have been better off without an agent because there are actually some editors who will accept queries, or if you meet them at a convention, they will say, "What do you write?" And, "Oh, really? That's exactly the kind of thing I publish. I would be interested in taking a look at that." If you meet them personally and they ask to see it, you don't need an agent to send them the book. Now, if they love your novel, you can actually contact a couple of agents and see if they're interested because they already want to buy your book. It's a much easier sell to get a good professional agent if you've already got the fish on the line. But, please don't negotiate a contract without an agent or without, some people do use an intellectual property attorney, somebody who's in entertainment, which also works, but it has to be somebody who understands the entertainment and literature business so that they know which things to suggest taking out of the contract and which things are okay. Sometimes, and I had a friend who did this, he sent in his book to a major publisher. The major publisher accepted it and said, we'll offer you this much, which was like the lowest they would give anybody at all for a book at the time. And then they they offered a very small amount of royalties, much smaller than was the industry average. And there's something called a boilerplate contract, which means they try to get everything they can possibly get. All of the rights that you will give to them, they try to get them all. And if you sign it without trying to negotiate at all, then they got everything they wanted. And chances are you're going to be kind of disgruntled in a couple of years when you find out that they get your firstborn child and that you signed that right away. Unless you did not what Kevin said, never mind.
But then it's the same agent that does the media stuff?
We have the same agent for original stuff and media stuff, yeah. And
Now, the media stuff we generally get ourselves because it's our connections with property owners, the DC Comics or...
yes, like the Buffy the Vampire Slayer novel. A friend of mine was writing for The Line, Buffy the Vampire Slayer, and told the editor that I would be a good person to write one of the books, and the editor approached me about the book. This wasn't something that my agent sold. And the same with Junior Jedi Knights and Young Jedi Knights. People at Lucasfilm approached us and asked us to write those. It wasn't our agent. But the agent can say, there's a new Terminator movie coming out. Do you want your name in the pool of people for writing the novelization of that book? And you can say, yeah, go ahead and put my name in. So that can happen.
But agents are a lot like insurance policies, that there are people that, why am I paying the agent for this commission?
Yeah.
They didn't really do anything. Why am I paying my fire insurance every month? My house hasn't burned down, that sort of thing. But when you do need an agent, when something blows up, when a publisher goes bankrupt and messes up all the rights of everything that they bought, or if there's a dispute with some other company or whatever, that's when you need the agent. And you, the author, want to be the good guy.
Yes.
And the agent is there to be the bad guy. And if the publisher is late paying you, you don't have to go and nag your editor. The agent nags the editor, so that you can be the charming author.
Or if your contract is to have your book published in hardcover, and the publisher decides to publish it in paperback and straight to paperback, if you want to pitch a fit, that's probably a very bad idea. Sometimes your agent can go in and talk them out of that. Not always, certainly. But if there's a situation that needs to be handled, it's nice to have that agent as an intermediary to keep things from getting unpleasant between you and an editor that you'd like to continue working with.
And I'm a sucky negotiator.
Oh.
That sounds great. I'll accept it.
Yes, Kevin will cave on anything. It's a good idea to have somebody who's a better negotiator.
She said, honey, can I be in your anthology? I just caved.
The price was right. Yes.
So if you've got a book accepted by a publisher, but you don't have an agent, I don't quite understand the time frame there. Like, how fast are they going to be saying, here's the contract, and they're thinking, I don't have an agent?
Okay, if somebody is interested in buying your book, but you don't have an agent yet, you usually have a little bit of time to arrange for getting an agent. Usually it takes weeks to months to actually produce a contract after they say that they will purchase your book. But first of all, you're going to need to negotiate the terms. So they're not even going to print up a contract until you've agreed on the terms. So in order to get an agent, it's a good idea to have a lot of friends who do have agents already so that you can ask them if you can get an introduction to an agent or how they would go about it. There are ways that you can look up. If you write exactly the same type of book as Stephen King, for example, then you might be able to find out other people that write in that genre and look down the list and see what agents they have.
But if a publisher calls and says, we love your book, we'd like to buy it, your immediate answer is,
yes,
that's wonderful.
I'll have my agent talk to you.
Do not agree to anything.
That's how my friend got the really bad contract he got, is that he agreed first because he had already gotten an offer. He didn't know that you could negotiate the offer and that there are things in the contract that even if the advance price is not negotiable to them, you can negotiate, how many authors' copies you get and what the due dates are and whether or not...
If HarperCollins calls and says that they want to buy your novel, almost any agent that you call, you can say, HarperCollins wants to buy my novel, would you negotiate the terms? The agent, you've already done the work. The agent should already say...
That's not always true, though.
Not always, but you should be able to find an agent in that case. If you're calling an agent and saying, I'm thinking of writing a book someday, would you be my agent?
If they're a good agent, their answer should be no.
Yes, I don't want to mess up.
Although it's also not just it's not also just about the terms, because last spring I was doing a book signing with more than one of my books, and a publisher approached me, and he said he wanted to have a meeting with me. I met with him multiple times. I met with his manager, that he was because he bought a publishing company, another publishing company, different things were going on. All this was all good. The contract was... I didn't like the terms because it was going to be one of those net things. And so
yeah.
The 25% gross because I write and illustrate. And so I renegotiated. They changed all their terms. We did the contract. I signed everything. But then he left the country and it's all been... But thankfully I wrote kind of a term in there. But it's not all about the terms because sometimes you can get stuck in weird, non-competitive clauses and when it comes to some...
Oh, that's another thing that an agent can negotiate for you, because Kevin and I tend to write in several different series, and there was one publisher that offered on a series of books we wrote, and in the contract it said we could not write anything else for any other publisher while we were writing this trilogy. And that's
turned in once a year or something.
And they had to be turned in once a year. And it was a pittance. It wasn't enough money to live on. We live off of our writing. So they had to take out, we couldn't write any other young adult fantasy novels during that time, for example. So that was a different sort of non-competition clause that they had to put in. But it would have been hard to negotiate that ourselves without an agent. I think that's pretty much time. Thank you for coming.